This is my 48th video on my work with OO gauge. See part 1 of this series for my reasons for getting into OO gauge when I already had a lot invested in working in N gauge and I didn't really have space available for a large, fully operational OO gauge layout. Also see my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for smaller and more complex scenery and smaller scale trains running. This part is the 22nd, dealing with my third layout made using mainly Hornby EZ Track. See the prior video, part 27, for my reasons for wanting to try a Hornby EZ Track layout when I already had an OO gauge layout using Bachmann EZ Track. This part covers my build of the Superquick Village School card kit B31. Here's the kit as it comes, a standard slim package like all Superquick kits. Here's what you get when the kit is unpacked. One folded sheet of printed card parts, 2 printed paper sheets with instructions, one of which also includes some paper parts, a typical Superquick small cramped sheet of glazing parts, and a warranty card. Here are the printed card parts unfolded. As usual with Superquick, the parts are printed touching each other and embedded in each other, with no very clear indications as to where to cut to separate the parts. This makes getting the parts out of the sheet something of an adventure in itself. Here's the back of the sheet of printed card parts. Superquick kits always seem to be made this way, with a printed paper facing stuck to a brown card backing. This does make the parts prone to warping, and straightening out warping in the parts is another constant part of building Superquick kits. The kits use various techniques with folding tabs, etc. to help with this, but those techniques are not always enough to guarantee success in your battle with warped parts. I'm just going to say up front with this one that I found this the most difficult to assemble of all the Superquick kits that I've worked with to date. With poor instructions and parts that didn't quite fit together, on top of the usual issues with Superquick kits, this one was a real struggle at times. You'll see what I mean as we go along. This was the first part to be separated from the sheet, the walls for one section of the main building, which was referred to as Room A. I've managed to cut it from the sheet without accidentally cutting off any of its bits, but I haven't yet taken out the windows and door blanking pieces. Here I have taken out all of the blanking pieces and also made sure that all of the tabs are properly separated and can bend. Taking the window blanks out of Superquick kits is quite delicate and time-consuming in itself, as you want to make a neat job of it. They tend to be attached quite solidly, usually in their corners, and careful cutting with a thin, sharp knife is necessary to get them out without ragged tearing. Especially with the windows with curved tops, it's extremely difficult to do this without some damage to the printing of the frames. I did nick a couple of the frames in this case, and I did my best to patch the damage with a brown marker. The glazing parts need to be attached next. The instructions did make clear which glazing pieces should be used for these walls. They have little numbers on them, and the instructions said which numbers to use. And the process was somewhat simplified by glazing for groups of close-together windows being handled with single glazing parts. Superquick instructions always say to attach the windows with sticky tape, and I always decline to do this, as I wouldn't have confidence in the attachment being lasting. I glue the glazing parts in place. This is made somewhat difficult by the fact that only very thin borders are provided on the parts. Wherever possible, I leave some extra material attached to the parts to make gluing them in place easier. You can see here that I've managed to make all of these glazing parts a bit bigger than they were originally supposed to be. Obviously, this has to take into account the location of fold lines, etc. Here are those walls from the front after glazing. Packing pieces to support the barge boards are then glued against the top edges of the front wall. This is the part for the floor of this section as it comes from the sheet. Typically for Superquick, rather than using a solid part, they embed 2 other parts nested within the floor. After taking out the embedded parts and setting them aside for later use, the floor is used to frame the walls for Room A. I did these 2 walls first. The floor is glued down on top of the folded bottom tabs. Note that I'm doing this on a piece of scrap foam board rather than on my cutting mat, as it requires gluing at ground level and I don't want to smear glue on my mat. The foam board also provides a better, evenly flat surface than the mat. The back door for room A needs to be found and attached over the floor. It came out of the sheet with that bottom left corner missing. The door is glued in place, aligned with the door opening. Fiddly to do, as there's very little extra material on the door to work with. This reinforcing strut will be used to help with straightening one of the walls. The strut will be folded in the middle before attaching it, which should basically force it straight. Here's that strut in place. Techniques such as this are necessary to combat the tendency of the parts to warp. Here are 2 brackets and another strut, which will be used to reinforce the assembly of the A walls. The brackets are used to hold the 2 top tabs at right angles to the wall. Then a flat piece will glue across between those 2 top tabs. This is not the strut I got out before. I thought it was going to be, and I nearly got the parts confused, but this is the part that's supposed to glue between those 2 tabs. This flat strengthener just glues across under the 2 top tabs. It's also glued by its edge to the wall, so preventing the wall from warping along its length. Now, the remaining 2 walls are folded round and their bottom tabs are glued under the floor frame. Here's a view of this assembly from the bottom at this point. At least at ground level it should be held straight and square by this arrangement, or the warping tends to creep in further up the walls. Now that strut from before is folded at a right angle and glued under the top tab of the short wall. Then the other end of that strut is glued to the back wall, and the other short wall is folded round and glued to the strut and to the floor. Next, an upper floor part, the brown rectangle here, is glued in place to straighten the front wall and square the upper front corners. This was a very difficult piece to glue in place, as there was a very pronounced warp in the upper front wall, which made it hard to get the straight edge of this part to glue to the wall. At the same time, we want to glue the brown piece to the folded top tabs at either end, holding the corners square. But it's essentially impossible to get your fingers in to hold these attachments while the glue sets, if you can actually get them square. I did my best to get everything straight and square, doing the attachments one at a time and using tweezers to hold the parts together until the glue set. Hopefully the result is not too bad. We want to see the brown piece attached to the front wall all along its length, and the side walls parallel with the edges of the brown piece. Now a folded ridge strut is glued across the top of the ridge between the front and back walls. The main function of this is to keep the front and back walls separated by the correct amount at the top of the ridge, providing the proper support for the roof. The roof of this section can now be glued in place. The sides of the dormer need to be folded back inside the main roof and glued at the side to the roof. In order to avoid smearing glue on the outside, I glued the dormer sides to the roof from the inside after attaching that side of the main roof to the walls. Now I had one side of the main roof attached and the sides of the dormer neatly glued to the main roof. Next I folded down and glued in place the other side of the main roof. A little bit too much glue here and there, but it will dry transparent, and in any case the barge boards will attach over the top of the front wall. The dormer roof was also glued over the dormer at this point, attached at the back to the main roof. And here is that front wall of room A with the barge boards attached over the packing pieces under the edge of the roof. This section is now essentially complete and will be set aside for a while. The hole in the side wall is where the rest of the structure will attach. So far, the instructions for this kit had been no worse than usual for Superquick kits, heavily verbal and so requiring very careful reading, but essentially correct and complete if very diligently interpreted. These are the walls for Room B, the other main building section. I haven't started taking out any of the blanks yet. Here are those walls after removing the window and door blanks and embedded parts and freeing all of the tabs. All of the remaining glazing parts will attach to these walls, 3 groups of 2 windows and 2 individual small windows. Again, I've left some extra material on the glazing parts to help with gluing them in place wherever this was possible. I use scissors to cut the glazing parts out, although it is possible to cut them with a sharp knife. Here are those glazing parts glued in place. The small dormer window was the trickiest, as there was not much space on the wall where it needed to fit. And here are those walls from the outside after glazing. Packing pieces are cut to length and glued against the top edges of the front wall. Again, a floor frame is glued to the bottom tabs of the walls. I started by gluing the floor frame to a single wall, but I folded the other walls up as I positioned it to make sure it was attached in the right place. Then a second wall is folded up and attached to the floor frame by its bottom tab, and then a third wall is so attached. The instructions just say to attach the floor to the 3 walls. I find it easier to do this neatly if I do one wall at a time. Here's where we are after that attachment. Now the side door glue's in place. I got a bit confused here, and this was my own fault. I was concerned that the door piece wasn't tall enough to cover the hole in the wall. So I attached it at first like this, trying to cover the hole in the wall as best as possible. But then I realized that the next sentence in the instructions clearly said that there was supposed to be a gap at the top of this door, so I detached it and reattached it at the bottom like this. A small floor part is glued into the entry section at the far end of these walls. I glued it first to the tab at the bottom of the end wall, and then glued it to the bottom tab of the other wall holding the corner square. Then a piece glues on top of that floor to make a surface texture, which may be seen through the open entry door. Now another supporting piece is attached at the top of those entry walls, glued all round 3 edges to hold those walls straight and square. It was around this point that I really started to struggle with the instructions of this kit. The instructions said to attach these 2 B brackets to strengthen the wall joins, but they really didn't say where, and no illustration was provided. I assumed the intention must have been to attach the brackets as shown here. The instructions then said to attach this flat roof piece. They said it should be aligned with the back and side walls of the entry and should overhang the door, but again no illustration was provided. I attached it like this, but later results led me to believe that I should have attached it the other way round, with the weird little markings towards the white wall. The next thing the instructions dealt with was the entrance canopy, made from 2 parts as seen here. The bracket is glued to hold the 2 sections of the canopy at right angles. The instructions just said to attach this canopy, but gave no indication as to where and how. Looking at the package illustration, I gathered this canopy should attach with its lower edge aligned with the upper dark row of bricks in the walls. The bracket of the canopy stuck out over the back of the canopy, preventing it from attaching to the wall properly, so I used an emery board to file the bracket down flat with the horizontal section of the canopy. I attached the canopy directly under the overhanging flat roof, as this seemed to bring it to the correct height. This was a mistake, as it did not allow for attaching the roof of the canopy, which would need to go all the way back to the wall when it was attached later on. And this was where I really struggled. The instructions said to attach the main roof of this section now. They had never said anything that I could understand about closing up the walls to join the entry section with the rest of the building. Clearly this needed to be done, and it was very difficult to do. When I initially tried to fold things together, I couldn't get the front wall of the entry to join up with the side wall properly. It simply wasn't possible to push them into a position where the side wall joined evenly along the edge to the printed entry wall. In order to get this assembly to work, I had to trim a couple of parts. First, I trimmed the top back corner of the side wall where it met the entry, as this was necessary to get it to fit under the flat roof. Trimming there removed the obstruction to those walls joining, but they still didn't want to go together, as the B floor frame was holding the side wall out too far. So I trimmed a sliver off the back of the B floor frame where it met the back wall, to allow the front and back walls to be pushed a little closer together at that side. With those trimmings, I was finally able to get the walls folded round and joined, with a reasonably neat join between the side wall and the entry wall. Again, I couldn't find anything in the instructions telling me to do this at all, let alone telling me how to do it. The next thing in the instructions had been to attach the roof, which I now considered doing. The instructions didn't mention a B ridge board, but there was a part clearly labelled as such. So I attached the B ridge board similarly to A between the tops of the front and back walls. It seemed to me that whoever wrote these instructions couldn't be bothered too much by the time they got towards the end, as various instructions were offhand to the point of being nearly useless or simply missing altogether. Now the roof could glue in place. As with the A roof, the dormer sides needed to be folded inside. I actually glued these from the outside to the roof as it was hard to get inside. Then the other side of the roof glued down. It didn't quite meet the flat roof of the entry very well, and those weird markings remained very visible. I did my best with a black marker to hide the weird markings. I believe they should have been on the other side of the flat roof, where they might have eventually been hidden. Not that they ever served any purpose at all, as far as I could see. The barge boards were glued over the packing under the front end of the roof. The kit didn't bother with barge boards for the back ends of the roofs, only the front ends. I guess they designed the kit more to be viewed from the front, which is rather a shame, as it will be mainly seen from the back where it's going on my layout. These are the parts for the canopy of the side door, the one that was supposed to have the gap above it. The bracket glues to hold the canopy at a right angle. In this case the bracket was a bit too high, so I sanded it down level with the peak of the canopy. This canopy then slots in above the side door. There are now 3 small roofs to be put in place, 1 for a dormer and 2 for the canopies. Here's the roof on the side canopy. And here's the roof on the dormer. The instructions said to attach the 2 main building sections together before attaching the entry canopy roof. Attaching the 2 sections together was tricky. The B section was essentially inserted into the hole in the side wall of the A section, and neat joins needed to be made between the walls of the 2 sections at the front and the back. I couldn't do this with the building on a flat surface, as I really needed to align the edges of the walls carefully and press them together until the glue set, which I could really only do by putting fingers inside the building from the bottom. I also couldn't find any way to see and hold the back and front walls at the same time, so I basically had to glue the back join, set that, and then glue and set the front join. I did manage to get the sections joined together reasonably neatly. Unfortunately, the place where I covered the weird markings on the flat roof is fairly obvious. Oh well, maybe there was a leak in the roof that they had to repair with tar or something. I had made another problem for myself here. As mentioned earlier, when I attached the entry canopy, I put it right up under the flat roof overhang, not realizing that I would need to get a roof in over the canopy. So the only way I could get the canopy roof to fit at this point was to cut a notch into the front of the flat roof. Not an ideal solution, but it seemed the best way to go to me under the circumstances. Clearer instructions could have avoided this problem, as with several others. The chimney stack for the building came as a paper part. This is typical for Superquick kits, but I wish they wouldn't do it, as paper doesn't make for a neat, rigid stack. The paper part is folded round and the tab glues inside to make an approximately rectangular stack. There was a paper part for a band at the top of the chimney and card parts for a chimney top. The card parts glue on top of each other and then on top of the chimney to make a stepped cap. The band is then glued around under the cap. And here's the finished chimney as best as I could do it. The chimney then glues up against the back wall of the building. This is the main part for the playground walls. For some parts of the length, pieces fold down and glue to provide the back surface of the brick. For other areas, paper parts need to be cut out and glued to the back. Here are the walls, with the paper parts glued to the back as best as I could manage. I found it hard to cut the curves precisely. Those walls then fold and glue around the edges of the play area base. I did the front section first, and then the rest of the other side and the back. This was very messy gluing right on the ground, so I worked on scrap foam board. Now, this playground assembly is meant to glue round the building, but it wouldn't go into place properly as the short side wall was too long. You can see here that with the short side wall pressed against the front wall of the building, there's a very pronounced gap between the playground surface and the building wall. So I had to shave about 1/16 of an inch off the end of that short sidewall to get it to the point where it was slightly recessed from the edge of the base so that the base could go into the groove at the bottom of the building wall. There is a card part for the outside side door. This part folds double as the door will be seen from both sides. After I folded the part double and glued it, the bottom ends didn't align, so I shaved off the extra card to align the ends. That door glues between the side wall and the fence. It seems a bit odd to me, as if there should be more of a frame somehow. Well, that's almost it. In fact, it was the end of the instructions. There were no more instructions. But I noticed that these parts of the doorsteps hadn't been attached. They needed to go on now after attaching the playground, as they sit on top of the playground surface. Here's the side doorstep in place, and here's the entrance doorstep in place, hiding the gap left by the playground surface there. I tried to tidy up the paper backing of the gate sign a bit. Now the building really is complete apart from gutters and ridge tiles. The instructions had actually said to attach the gutters and ridge tiles at various points along the way, but I deliberately left them all to the end. The gutters and ridge tiles, as is standard with Superquick kits, were paper parts that needed to be cut out and folded. The gutters get a doubled black section and a tab that folds up and glues under the edges of the roof. I recolour them thoroughly with a black marker, since otherwise dotted lines and edges would be visible. I cut pieces of guttering to appropriate lengths and glued them up under the various roof edges. It's not the easiest thing to do, as they don't much want to stick under the edge of the roof, and the barge boards get in the way, necessitating cutouts at the ends of the gutters. For the ridge tiles, I tried the technique suggested by the instructions, where the scoring is done on the back of the parts rather than the front. This should help to make the folds less visible. I cut out the various sections of the ridge tiling, and coloured all of the edges with a brown marker. And here are the ridge tiles in place. It was harder to fold them with the scoring on the back, but having the scoring on the back did remove most of the need to colour the folds. They still split and needed to be coloured a bit in places. So there's the structure complete. Some of my problems are still visible, unfortunately, but it's not too bad. Here it is on the layout. It fitted pretty well to the template that I had for it. Unfortunately, given the place I have for it, it will be mostly seen from the back like this. And here's the view of the layout now. Just the one paper template left for the other signal box in the foreground here, though I actually still have several other kits to build in addition to that. They just didn't get templates in my initial design. There'll be buildings on either side of the current station building and also on the other station platform.